consideration must not be passed.
Hi everyone, Assalamulaikum and a very good day to all of you. I am Aqilah as the first presenter of the rule consideration must not be passed. Without wasting any time, let me tell you what is the concept and the definition of consideration must not be passed. In order for a promise or act to be considered as having legal consideration, it must be accompanied by something given, done, or promised in return by the other party. If one party provides something of value to another party without receiving anything in return, it cannot be considered valid consideration. Consideration must be given in exchange for a promise or act. If one party completes performance before the other offers consideration, it is unlikely that the earlier performance was done in return for that consideration. The concept of the rule is to emphasize that the key factor is not the timing of the consideration, but rather whether it was given in exchange for the other party's consideration.
Hi, my name is Ilham Adila Binti Mohammad Zuhairi and I am your second presenter. Now we will move on to the next part, which I will explain about the example of the past consideration. The situation is when A lost his cat at the park, and after a while, B found the cat and returned it to A without having any intention to get reward or appreciation. Then, A promised to pay $50 to B as a reward for his kindness. However, as time goes by, A refused to pay the reward to B when B demanded for it. In this case, B cannot enforce the promise because the promise was not considered as a valid consideration. The question is, why it is not enforceable by the law? This is because the promise was made after B had found A's cat, which the action has been passed. So, at the first place, both parties are not bound by any contract and they are not even having any intention to create a legally binding contract.
Hi, my name is Nadiatul Binti Mohammad Razif and I am your third presenter. So now we will move on to the question, can past consideration be a good consideration? As it was mentioned before, past consideration is regarded as a void consideration and it cannot form a legally binding contract. Therefore, consideration must be given in return for the promise or act of the other party. However, did you guys know that there are certain circumstances that allow past consideration to be a proper consideration and form a legally binding contract? There are three factors that recognize this type of past consideration. First and foremost, the consideration must be provided at the request of a party. Secondly, both parties understood that the payment will be made gradually. And the third one, that gradual payment must be promised to the other party in advance. Next, let us take a look on the decided cases.
Hi, my name is Nurshamira Aryna Binti Harmi Thamri, your fourth presenter. Now, let's take a look at the case of Roscorla and Thomas. In 1842, there was a person named Thomas who owned a horse. One day, Thomas decided to sell his horse. Roscorla was the person who was interested in purchasing the horse from Thomas. So, Roscorla then purchased the horse by entering into a contract with Thomas. After the contract was made, Roscorla asked Thomas for an assurance related to the horse being sound and free from viciousness. Then, Thomas gave the promise. Later, Roscorla found out that the horse became vicious. Due to that, Roscorla sued Thomas for breach of contract. There was no consideration for the promise that the horse was sound. The only consideration alleged was the contract for the horse sale, preceding the defendant's promise. It meant the assurance of the promise was not neither part of bargain nor given in exchange for the promise. Consequently, it was not a good consideration. Finally, Thomas won the case because the assurance of the promise was not a part of the contract and was not supported by any new consideration.
Hi, my name is Nurshamira Binti Mohammad Sobri, your fifth presenter. In the case of Free Mcardle, Mr. William Mcardle, who is the testator, and his wife, Mrs. Holly Mcardle, who had the residuary estate upon his 5 children, of whom Monty Mcardle was the one. Monty Mcardle and his wife execute certain works of improvements and repairs to this property, the cost of which amounting to £488 was paid by Mrs. Marjorie Mcardle. In April 1945, Monty Mcardle presented to each of his three brothers and his sister a document which he and they signed in that the executors should pay back the cost of improvements made for the bungalow to Mrs. Marjorie from the proceeds of selling the house. After Mrs. Holly Mcardle died, Mrs. Marjorie asked for the money and the payment was not made. The judge decided that the dispute in favor of Mrs. Marjorie Mcardle on the footing that there was an equitable assignment of £488, there being no contract between her and the signatories of the document of April 30, 1945, since there was no consideration moving from her. The consideration for the execution of the document of 30 April 1945 being passed and the document was neither pacted. It is not binding as the agreement made after the consideration had been performed. Hence, past consideration is no consideration.
Finally, let's listen to the commentaries from us.
In the instance of Mrs. Mcardle, she is not eligible for the composition because prior to the contract being signed, she was a mere volunteer. Consequently, there is a lack of consideration between her and Monty's siblings. In this case, it is essential to have consideration in order for a contract to be enforceable, and the parties must agree on the terms of the agreements before it takes place.
In the case of Roscorla and Thomas, the case highlighted that promises made after the formation of a contract are not enforceable. In the case, Roscorla should have asked about the characteristic of the horse before making a contract. Instead, he did not. Consequently, he was bound under the contract and cannot get any compensation. The lesson is, before entering a contract, you should ask about the consideration until you are highly persuasive, or else you will end up being like Roscorla.
Okay, now in my opinion, this rule is really important because let's say this rule is vanished. It turned out consideration can be passed. I'll give you an analogy. Let's say in the beginning, I am willing to give you my Ferrari car for free. Of course you accepted it. But after a few days, I came back and claimed the money from you in return for that car. How would you feel? Is it fair? No, right? So, allowing past consideration surely leads to dispute and disagreement between both parties.
Past consideration does not include the contemporaneous exchange that is necessary for valid consideration. As we all know, past consideration that is occurrences or activities that had place before the contract. Therefore, it is typically unenforceable. The fairness and integrity of contractual agreements, it is upheld by this idea. So, there are no parties who would feel unjustness and unfairness where they want to bind a contract.
So, in conclusion, it is important to note that past consideration cannot be considered as valid in contract law. So, in order to have a proper consideration, both parties must exchange something of value or make a present commitment as consideration to create a legally binding contract. That's all from us. Thank you for listening.
We hope you guys get benefits from this video. Don't forget to subscribe,
Like and share. Bye!